just kidding. So, okay. I'll wait till everybody gets back in, and I will. It's almost everybody.
Will there be lab next week, or is it just the
exam? The exam will usually take. Well, I will say that some people take a long time and some people take a short time, but I let everybody take as long as they need to take the exam. So there's no limit other than 3:45 in the afternoon. So generally, I don't plan on doing anything else next week except the exam. So, okay. Now, let's not let me press anything wrong this time around. I think everybody's back in. Let's press share screen. And go, hey, I didn't do it wrong that time. Okay, now. So this is the human skull. And this is what passes for humor in our division, but so anyway. Okay, so how many bones are there altogether in the human body? Well, there's 206, and that's a pretty good number. But the nice thing is that half of them on the left side, half up on the right side, they're all the same. The bones of the arms and legs and fingers and toes, hands and feet, whatever you have on the left side, you have on the right side. So it isn't like you have to learn 206 different structures other than left and right. And I'm usually not big on left and right on the body, on the bone parts anyway. There are lots of openings in the bones and bumps and what we call processes and structures. So it's more than just the 206 bones. There's a lot of things to learn. And as we go along, there's a reason for this. Well, first of all, if you're going into healthcare, this is something actually relevant. This is something that actually applies to what you're looking at. Whether you're going into radiology or nursing or surg tech or physical therapy or any of the other areas that you might look into, knowing the bones and their locations makes lots of sense. Plus, this will make learning the muscles, the next unit, a great deal easier. Because if you know where the bones are, then you know what the muscles are. And you know what the actions of the muscles are, where they rotate the bones. When we explain why you can do things like turn a doorknob or nod your head or turn to the left and right, or the whole process of breathing, it has to do with the combination of the muscles and the bones. So there's a lot of relevance in this unit in lab and the unit right after that on learning the muscles. It isn't just because, well, we learned them, so you have to learn them too. So, but it isn't, yes, it requires memorization and you have to familiarize yourself with the bones. One of the reasons why that I give you at least a month before we have the bone test is to take the time to learn these bones. And this is not the thing that you can wait till the night before the test and spend 4 or 5 hours and learn everything. I've had lots of students come in and say, I don't understand. I spent 8 hours studying for this test last night. And did you study? No, I just waited until the night before. It's not going to cut it. Because 8 hours, you might be able to memorize it. You might be able to memorize enough to pass the test, but you're not going to learn it. If you take it slow, like tonight, I know that, if you spend 10 minutes looking at one structure on the skull, or 2 or 3 bones and learn and memorize those. I mean, it's not that hard to pick out 2 or 3 bones. There's a bone in the skull that everybody gets right, and that's the frontal bone. It's the one right here in the front. Nobody ever gets that wrong. And it's usually on the test at some point. Well, there's one of the 206 bones right there. So there are certain, if you learn a little bit every night and do this every night leading up for the next 3 or 4 weeks, you won't have memorized them, you'll have learned them. And that's the only way to nail these down. They say, the old story, you don't eat the elephant all at once. It's one bite at a time. Well, you learn these bones one bone at a time, and just take your time a little bit every night, commit to memory a couple more bones, and amazingly, you'll blast through the bone test with no problems at all. So, and I see lots of people score very well on the bone test, particularly if they were disappointed on their first lab test, which, I've spent a lot of time saying, make sure you know this stuff. So I expect great things in the lab on lab test 1. But people historically that have done poorly on lab test 1 bounce back and really focus on the bones, and it's nothing to see lots of 90s and aboves in the bone test. So just throw that out there for you. It's not impossible. It's just some of it's tedious, but it's not impossible. Sort of like talking about chemistry in lecture today. It's not impossible, just tedious. So, okay. So we have 206 bones in the body. We have 22 in the skull. The skull is the most complex bone structure in the body. All these bones fit together in here in a very complex puzzle arrangement. And we have actually somewhere around here what we call an articulated skull that is separated out into the pieces. And it's so separated so well that when we got it, we couldn't put it together. So that's why we don't use it, and it won't stay together either. So, but it does really fit together very nicely. So this is an X-ray of the skull and the cervical vertebrae. If you ever had the 360-degree panoramic dental exam done of your teeth, this is something similar where it does the whole skull and the cervical vertebrae. And you can see this apparently was done because there's a big dark spot on the skull. You can see it there, right there. It looks like it's sort of flattened a little bit, and there's a dark spot there. We shouldn't have dark spots on our bone. So something's going on there. But this does show you the skull itself. It gives you the upper and lower jaw, and it gives you all the vertebrae down, the cervical vertebrae plus some of the thoracic vertebrae down here. This is just, I like this simply because it gives you a little bit of perspective on exactly what we're looking at today. So the first bone that we encounter is the frontal bone. It's in the front. It goes down to right above the top of your nose. It comes on top of each eye orbit, and it extends to about halfway back. On the top and on the sides too. So this gives definition to the front of our head. It's also where we have lots of muscles, very thin muscles run underneath that skin. And we use those muscles for showing expression. We'll get into that later on. But when we react to things, we scrunch up our skin, and it's the muscles that are doing that for us. Very thin layer of skin and muscle on top of the bone, because you can feel your bone, right underneath the skin there. So but it is a large structure, and again, nobody ever gets this wrong, and it's perfectly okay to feel yourself when you're trying to check where a bone is too during a test. Now, so this is our skull right here. And the first thing we see is this opening for the eyeball. And we call these the eye orbits. And that's the area, the eyeball fits in there. And you can see there's 2 openings in the back, one for the optic nerve to go through, and one for blood vessels to come through to supply the eyeball. But this is the eye orbit. And what you also might notice on your skull that you've got in front of you is that there is a little notch above the orbit and an opening below the orbit. Let me move this out of the way. There we go. Okay, now there is a notch, and that's called the supraorbital notch. Supraorbital notch is supra means above. Supra means above. So supraorbital means above the orbit. And there's a little notch there. Doesn't show up on this, but here, let me switch this to Where is not sharing for a second? Put it on the other camera. Okay, here we go. Share screen. That's not what I want. Okay, so if you can see on this, there is a little notch right there. Just barely see it here on this particular model. It may show up on a number of the other skulls that are here in class, but this is the supraorbital notch, because there's the orbit right there, and this is the notch above the orbit. Now this opening down here below the orbit is the intraorbital foramen right here. And so we have two terms here we use to describe positions on the skull. We have the supra and infra positions. The supra always means above. Infra always means below. So there's the eye orbit. There's the supraorbital notch and the infraorbital foramen. Now, foramen means opening. We all know what a notch is. A notch is just a notch. It's an indentation, if you will. Now, a foramen is another term for an opening, a true hole in the bone. Foramen is a passageway for a blood vessel or a nerve or both. So we have the infra below the orbit foramen, and we're going to use supra and infra a number of times in all of our bones here. So supra means above, infra means below. So the infraorbital foramen, supraorbital notch, passageways for blood vessels and nerves or both in here. Now this is the optic foramen, this hole located right in here. And that is the passageway for the optic nerve. You've probably all heard of the optic nerve. You know what an optic nerve is. It leads to the back of the eyeball and it brings information to the brain. So that opening there is the optic foramen for the passageway of the optic nerve to go into the brain. Now, the beauty of this is that foramen continues all the way through to the other side, which opens up inside the cranial cavity. We'll see the other end of it when we get into the skull, open up the skull. So that's the optic foramen. And directly in front of that is a bone. Let me move this out of the way here. There we go. On either, we find this bone on either side of the optic of the orbit. It's called the ethmoid bone. So it shows up behind our nasal cavity. I can't stick my fingers in my eyes, but it would be right inside on the what we call the medial side of the orbit, just behind the nasal bones. And it's a lot bigger than it looks because it extends from one orbit to the other orbit. It also extends up into the base of the skull and down into the nasal cavity itself. So it's a fairly large bone. So you can see it outlined there. And this one, it looks like it says it's might be a 3 or a 5 or whatever. But if you have a skull model in front of you, you should be able to see it outlined. And let's see, okay, frontal bone. Now, directly behind the frontal bones are what we call the paired parietal bones. The parietal bones are on either side of the skull. Behind the frontal bone, they extend from about the midline all the way back to almost the base of the skull in the back. So they're paired on both sides. Let's see if I can do this without messing anything up. Okay. So here's our frontal bone on our skull right here. And then behind the frontal bone are the two parietal bones. Go now. There we go. Frontal bone and the paired parietal bones. The frontal bone extends about to the mid-level. The parietal bones go from all the way down where my thumb is, all the way around both sides, and cover the top, most of the top, and part of the sides of the brain inside here. So you can see the this suture line right there that divides, because there's two parietal bones that we see here. One, they're side by side. They are going to have they're going to join in the middle, and they're going to join along the end of the frontal bone too. Now, it's okay, they're unbreakable. Okay, now, so we see the frontal bone, we see the parietal bones, and now we see this little bone on the side here called the sphenoid bone. It's, if you can feel the outside edge of your eye orbit, you can feel the sharp edge right around your eye orbit, then right behind that on each side is the sphenoid bone, and it extends from one side of the skull to the other side, and it forms part of the base of the cranial cavity inside. But all we see here is this area projecting out to the sides here and here. So if you feel the edge of your eye orbit right behind it, you can feel the sphenoid bone. It goes all the way across. Internally, it's a huge bone. The front part of the brain sits essentially on top of the sphenoid bone. Below the sphenoid and on the sides, we have what are called the temporal bones. The temporal bones, if you stick your fingers in your ear, you're at the location of the temporal bones. This all along this flat area, because the parietal bone comes down to about the level of the top of your ears, and then everything down along the side here to the end of the bone, end of the skull. On the back portion here is the temporal bone. We have one on either side. So we have frontal in the front, parietals on top, temporals on the side. And we see one of them here on the slide. There's one on the other side too. Now this bone that forms our cheekbone, we can feel it. We can go to the eye orbit and rub your fingers along the base of the eye orbit and feel that ridge that comes back along the sides like this. That's known as the zygomatic bone. And so our zygomatic bone is a very prominent bone. It gives shape to the eye orbits, and depending on the genetic makeup of the individual, it can determine, it can show you the orbit may be rounded, or it may be more squared, it may be larger, it may be less pronounced. It has a lot to do with, are they male, are they female, and are they Asian? The three big, Caucasoid, Negroid, and what's the one for Asian? I forget. So those are the three genetic makeups that we see. Of course, everything, there's a lot of blending of traits, but generally we see some fairly distinct shapes of the orbits. The orbit in a female skull tends to be rounder and softer in edges than in the male skull. Native Americans have a very pronounced orbit here, as do descendants from various Asian countries too. So you can tell a lot just by looking at skull. If you were working in forensic science and you had a skull of unknown source, you could look at it and make a lot of determinations just by the shape of the like the orbit. This is a male skull. I know it's a male skull because that's what it said in the label. But you notice that the orbit of the male skull is squared off. If it was a female skull, it would be more round, for example. So, and there's a lot of, as we say, we see a lot of genetic blending now in the past 50 years. So it's sort of, it's much harder now to make those kind of distinctions in some cases. Okay. Now, the upper jaw is called the maxilla. The maxilla doesn't move. The maxilla is part of the skull proper. The mandible, the lower jaw, is what moves. The mandible is brought up by muscles to bring the mandible with the teeth up against the teeth of the maxilla. So the lower jaw, what we call the mandible, we have three distinct sets of muscles which will pull the mandible up against the maxilla so we can crush and grind and rip and tear the foods that we eat. And so we see here, here's our mandible here, and it moves like this. And you can see what it's doing. And it's very rare for us to have a skull that the mandible actually moves because most of them are, well, you've got one that's still intact, but sort of still intact. They see a lot of abuse over the years. Anyway, that's the mandible. And there's a little groove here in the front, new term, symphysis. This is the mandibular symphysis. The mandibular symphysis is where two bones come together. A symphysis is where two bones come together. Now, the most prominent symphysis in our bodies is the pubic symphysis, and it's located in the pelvis where the hip bones come together in the front. And there's a big pad of cartilage there. We call that the pubic symphysis. And that's actually a physical separation of the pelvic bones. But here we have, they're fused, because when we were developing in utero, the mandible grew together from both sides. And for a long time, it was two separate bones, and then it fused together into one big bone. But the area there is still referred to as the mandibular symphysis. Okay, now, this is called the mandibular angle because the angle, this is where the bone turns up, because the top of the bone, the top of the mandible is going to articulate. Articulate means where two bones rub together. So like our arm articulates against our shoulder blade in here. Articulate, one bone comes together and moves against another one. And so for the mandible to work, it has to articulate against the base of the skull. And the angle is what brings the mandible up to where the articulation takes place. The ramus, that's just a term for the upright portion of the mandible. Oops, let me go back here. So what you're going to see on this one is, you can see the front portion of the of the mandible where the symphysis is located. And this second slide here, if you look at it carefully, you can actually see the line right in the middle where the mandibular symphysis is located. It's not something that really shows up well. We might see on the skull, you might see a little ridge on the mandible itself where the bones grow together. And that's not unusual for that to occur. I mean, the frontal bone started out as two separate bones and grew into one. It never formed two separate bones like the parietals did. Okay. So we've seen the frontal bone and the mandible. Let's take a look at the bones on the side here. We'll go back and we'll pick up the parietal and the temporals now. The temporal bone covers the area here. It surrounds the opening for the auditory canal, the auditory passageway, because the opening from the ear, the external ear has an opening that goes into the skull so that we can get to the inner ear to carry sound waves we can convert sound waves to nerve impulses and send them to the brain. And we can see this area highlighted on the temporal bone. The auditory canal is located right above this black arrow. This is the opening into the skull, and there's one on either side. And that opening extends into the inner ear. And then there's a passageway in the inner ear that takes the auditory nerve deep into the skull, into the brain. So we have this temporal bone right here. And there's a very specific term for this opening here. It's called the external acoustic opening, or external acoustic meatus. And there's an internal. Something about bones and muscles is if you have an external anything, you're going to have an internal. If you have a superior, you're going to have an inferior. If you have a supra, you'll have to have an infra. All the directional terms in our bodies are usually matched by their counterpart. So superior, inferior, external, internal, medial, lateral. Okay, now this next bone, well, I'll show you here in a second. This is called a suture line. A suture line is where two bones grow together. They don't move against each other anymore. They're frozen in position. So they're lined up together. The bones are actually fit together almost like a zipper, and how they're locked in place. And this is called the coronal suture. Remember the coronal cut where you divide the body into the front and anterior and posterior? This is what the coronal suture does. It's the junction of the frontal bone and the parietal bones here. Anytime we have bones growing together in the skull, they're always called a suture line. So we have a coronal suture, and we also have, you'll see here in a second, we have a sagittal suture. It's where the two parietal bones grow together. That's the coronal suture. There's our frontal bone. There is the parietal bone back here. There's the temporal bone. And of course, the cheekbone, the zygomatic bone, where you can feel that very prominently here. And this is a new one. This bone is at the base of the skull on the posterior surface. This is the occipital bone. Now, these bones are named for the lobes of the brain that they cover. Frontal bone covers the frontal lobes. Parietal lobe covers, the parietal bone covers the two parietal lobes. The occipital bone covers the occipital lobe, and the temporal bone covers the temporal lobes of the brain. And I'm assuming that the brain was named first, but it doesn't matter, which came first. Yeah, who cares? Frontal bone, frontal lobe, parietal bone, parietal lobes, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Now this is called the squamous suture line between the parietal and the temporal. And this one between the occipital and the parietal is called the lambdoid suture line. Now here is an easy bone to remember. It's the nasal bone. It only extends down about halfway. You can feel the top part of your nose. That's the nasal bone. Below that, the flexible portion is hyaline cartilage. So we all have a nasal bone, but we would actually have an extension. The rest of the bone, the rest of our nose would come down a little further like that because of the, maybe not quite that pointy, but you can feel the flexible portion of your nose. That's gone. When we're looking at a skeleton, we don't see that flexible portion. It has degraded, but the top portion of it is the nasal bone. And you can see the nasal bone is this one right here. Okay. Now here's another bone that you can feel. You reach behind your ear on each side, you'll feel a bump. back in this area. So sort of about it's behind your ear, sort of about the midline of your ear. And there's a little bump right back in here on each side. That's called the mastoid process. The mastoid process is a point of attachment of some very powerful muscles that we'll look at in the next unit that control your head in turning left or right. They attach here and they attach onto your sternum and they turn your head to the left and right. They're very long muscles that run down across here, but they attach it to the mastoid process. The mastoid process is also a very spongy area, meaning it's a lightweight bone. You know, what we call this spongy bone, and spongy bone looks like a sponge on the inside. It's got lots of little, it's honeycomb with lots of little cavities. That gives it great strength without a lot of weight, but it also makes a great sound chamber. So sound will pass through the mastoid process into the inner ear. And a person that has a problem with conduction deafness, for example, with the tympanic membrane, the eardrum not working properly, or the bones of the middle ear not working properly. A person that has conduction deafness, meaning they can't get the sound waves to convert to nerve impulses in their inner ear, can use a cochlear implant with a receiver embedded in their mastoid process on the surface of their skin, and it can send sound waves through their bone. In fact, we can even test that. We do that in the last set of labs we do on the nervous system. We can take a tuning fork and we can strike it and it'll create a tone, and you can place the tuning fork, the base of it, against the mastoid process, and you can hear the sound. It will go through the bone and go into the inner ear, and you can hear the note that the tuning fork is generating. And you can hold it there until it goes away, and to prove it was working, you can then take it and hold it against your ear with the forks up, and you can hear the note again. So you can hear it both directions. One at a time. You can hear it through here, or you can hear it through here. And it's sort of a very simplified test to see if your patient has conduction deafness or not. Because if they can hear it here, but not here, then there's a problem getting it to the inner ear. But if you can hear it here, it can still get to the inner ear. So, and so it's sort of an alternate passageway. And often, if you place your fingers over your mastoid process, you sound different in how you talk a little bit, because we are getting our sound waves from both our ear, and if we have no auditory issues, we're getting our sound waves through our ear and through the vibrations through the mastoid process. But if you block the mastoid process, it alters how you perceive yourself in speaking. And suddenly I feel like I'm speaking with a little more nasal influence there. And I'm probably not, but that's what it sounds like. When I take my fingers away, it sounds what I expect I sound like. I was going to say more normal, but define normal. Anyway, just something, the mastoid process is a structure that we never forget about. So there's the mastoid process. Now here is, right in front of the mastoid process is a little pointy thing called the styloid process. And we have a number of styloid processes throughout our bodies. A styloid process is nothing more than a pointy structure. Now, a process, I should have said this on the mastoid process. A process is a bump or a protrusion of bone. That's all it is. It's nothing fancy. Like the mastoid process is a lump of bone sticking out, a bump there. Styloid process is also an extension of bone. In this case, it's sharp and pointy. Processes are always going to be points of attachment for muscles. That's what they always are. So in the case of the styloid process, we call it that because the original term for a stylus was a sharp pointed stick to write with. Thousands of years ago, the written word was put down on tablets, usually of clay, and maybe the mark was made on a tablet. or maybe the clay was soft and you actually grooved lines into the tablet. And so you used a very sharp device, which the Latin term derived for it was stylus. And so now, that's what it's a sharp, pointy pencil, if you will. Over the years, stylus came to be used for other pointy things like the stylus is the structure in a turntable that you play a record with, that has a very thin pointy structure. Now we've come full circle and we have a stylus again, just like we have in our tablets. We really have come full circle, only now that it's electronic. And of course, I use this stylus to mark on the computer screen with. But if you have an iPad or something like that, you probably have a stylus for that, or your laptop. So we're back to where we started from 1,000 years ago. A little more advanced though. It's a structure for marking things. The term stylus came to mean anything sharp and pointy. Well, the styloid process is a sharp and pointy structure here in this case, in the base of the skull on the outside, where we attach muscles. We'll see some next week or in the week after when we look at the arm. The two bones in our forearm each have a styloid process of their own. Again, points of attachment for muscles. So there will be nothing on the test about styluses and tablets and stuff like that. I just got carried away. So, okay. This bone right here is that ethmoid bone I mentioned earlier inside the eye socket. And here you can see on this little animation here on the side, it's been spinning around here. You probably wondered what it was there for. That's the ethmoid bone here. It is about the middle of, it's on the medial surface, the inside surface of the eye socket. And it's about halfway back. It's sort of in a middle location there. There is one important bone right in front of it, and that's called the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone has an opening in there for the lacrimal gland. Lacrimal gland is the gland that releases tears to wash our eyeballs off. We clean our eyeballs. We blink all the time. We're busy washing the dust and dirt and debris and bacteria off of the surface of our eyeballs. The lacrimal fluids have antibacterial properties. So there's an opening right there for the lacrimal gland to penetrate to lubricate the surface of the eye. And so we have the ethmoid bone and the lacrimal bone side by side here on the medial surface of the orbit. Now this little opening here is called the mental foramen. And if you have your skull, you can see, let me get out of this for a second and go to the other camera. Okay. This little opening right there, there's my mandible, and this little opening that says 51, I just put a mark on, is the mental foramen. It's a passageway for blood vessels. Now there's another one on the other side, right there. And so we see those two structures, come on, there and there in the front of the skull. Now they are not the mandibular foramens. You would think they would be, but they're not. They are the mental foramens, one on either side, there and there. And again, we see, if we would look at blood vessels, we would see that there are small blood vessels that come through there, and maybe even some nerves that they have to innervate the skin, and they have to also provide nutrients to the bone, because remember, the bone's living tissue. So, and of course, if you wanted to see where that lacrimal bone was, right there on our see if this works better. There we go. there's our ethmoid bone right inside there. And in this case, there's our lacrimal bone right there in the front. Of course, there's the nasal bone there. So, and that sphenoid bone I mentioned earlier that you can feel on the side is located right there. Let me back up a little bit so you can see exactly where there's the sphenoid. Right behind the zygomatic bone, that large one, our cheekbone, right up in there. You can just feel it if you put your finger behind where the orbit's located. So. Okay, mental foramen. Now the occipital bone is located on the base of the skull back here. It covers the whole base of the skull. It even covers the opening, surrounds the opening of the largest foramen probably in the body. And so it protects the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is really important for us because the occipital lobe is mostly visual. In our brain, most of our, all of our visual information, our visual processing takes place in the occipital lobe back here. We don't see with our eyeballs. Our eyeballs only collect light rays. The occipital lobe has to process that information and tell us what we see. Because all the eyeballs do is get hit by light rays and convert those light rays to nerve impulses, which are sent through the optic nerve to the back of the brain in the occipital lobe. And then we tie all that information together so we know what colors are and shapes are and letters are and what words mean and signs mean and, you know, everything. But the eyeballs do nothing except collect information. This is the occipital lobe back here. You know, it comes all the way around from the back of the skull into the base of the skull. That very large opening that you see right there is where the spinal cord comes up and goes into the brain. So there's your occipital bone. It allows the spinal cord, that's what that yellow structure is there, to come up through the foramen magnum. And that's the connection between the spinal cord connects to the brainstem at the base of the brain. And that's how we communicate with the rest of the body. So the medulla oblongata is the lowest region, and we'll get all into this later on in the lecture, but the medulla oblongata is the lowest region of the brainstem, but it's definitely a very important structure, and it communicates, the end of the medulla oblongata and the beginning of the spinal cord sort of run together, and the spinal cord passes through that opening, then it runs down all the way to the area just about the end of, just below the end of our ribs. So, and that's where the spinal cord ends. So the opening is called the foramen, which is our term for all of our openings, magnum, the big hole, the big opening. And that's what the foramen magnum means. And so since that point, your spinal cord is about as big as your thumb, look at the size of the opening at the base of in the base of the skull. Your spinal cord has to come up through there. So it has to be, it's a very large opening. There is no opening anywhere in our bodies, in our bones, it's as big as that. So, okay, now I said a few minutes ago that you would expect to see the mandibular foramen. Well, there is one, but just not in front of the mandible. We have two openings on the inside of the mandible, on the ramus, the portion that goes upright, and that is, both of those are the, mandibular foramens on either side, but it's on the interior surface of the mandible. The exterior are the mentals, the interior are the mandibular. I don't know why. I would have probably called the ones on the outside mandibular myself, but that's just the way it is. But again, anytime you have an opening like that, it's always for the passage of blood vessels and nerves. Processes are usually points of attachment for muscles. Foramens are openings for blood vessels and for nerves. So I mentioned the suture before, and you saw the coronal suture there, but there's the coronal suture again, where the coronal bone comes together against the two parietal bones. Now, separating the parietal bones in half are the sagittal suture. Remember the sagittal cut in chapter 1, dividing right down the middle or maybe just slightly off to the side? Well, that's what you have here. It's a sagittal giving you a left and right parietal bone. So we have a coronal suture and a sagittal suture. And it says there are 17 sutures in the skull. We're not going to learn all 17 of them. So, but coronal and sagittal are very important suture lines here. And they there's a large groove in our brain. I don't have a big brain model here, but there's a large groove right down the middle of our brain called the longitudinal fissure. And it divides the brain into the left and right side. And the longitudinal fissure runs right underneath the sagittal suture. So, okay. And here's another, the suture lines there. Of course, there is the coronal suture right there, separating the frontal bone from the two parietals. Here we see the sagittal suture, and back here at the base is the occipital suture, and what was that called? The lambdoid suture, I think. Coronal, sagittal, lambdoid, yeah. So these are the main suture lines that we pay attention to here. And because we see the separation between the two parietals and the coronal and the parietals and the parietals and the occipital lobe. So let's go inside now and take a look at some of the structures. Two of the key bones here internally are called the sphenoid bone. Remember the sphenoid bone was right here in the side, now right here and here. And I said it went all the way through to the other side. The sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone are designed, they're designed to protect the underside of the brain. The brain's, the base of the underside of the front part of the brain, of the frontal lobes, essentially rests on top of the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone. Now, the sphenoid bone is a large bone that is shaped like a bat. It's sort of like, it's been called the Batman bone over the years because, particularly if you look at the smaller part of the sphenoid bone, it definitely looks like a bat. And it is what they call it, the keystone bone of the cranium, because it fits together. It goes all the way through from one side to the other, and the brain sits on top of it, and our pituitary gland, the master gland of our body, fits inside this little structure right in here where I've got the arrow. So, and then the ethmoid bone is this area over here. So the ethmoid bone plays a major role in being able to detect odors. So we have two key structures here making up the underside of the interior underside of the skull. So there's the sphenoid bone. The whole thing extends from side to side. You can see these flat areas projecting out on the side here are what we can feel. The green area that you can just barely see there is what's called the lesser wing of the sphenoid. And if you have a lesser, you got to have a greater, and the rest of it is called the greater wing of the sphenoid. So, and you can almost imagine the brain, the frontal lobes of the brain sitting down on top of this area right here. So, and that little area right there, that little notch you see as it goes around, is where the pituitary gland is located. We call that the master gland because it releases 8 different hormones in our bodies. Okay, and this is now this is the sphenoid bone. Let me show you here. This The sphenoid bone extends from here, like this, over to here, down around here like this, and back up like that. This area over here is what you're feeling on the outside. This area here is called the lesser wing of the sphenoid. This is the lesser wing. And this area down here is the greater wing of the sphenoid. And if you look carefully, you can almost imagine that this structure here, the lesser wing, looks like a bat. And once I suggested it, you can sort of see it looks like a bat. And so this is called, the whole thing, they say it's a bat-shaped bone, but it plays a major role here in protecting the underside of the brain. You notice there's a number of openings there, a number of foramens in here. And it does, when you're pressing the side of your skull behind your orbit, you're actually pressing against that region there and there, because this is part of the temporal bone here, but below that, you have that sphenoid bone right in the side there and there. So this is a very large bone that extends all the way from side to side. And so this is our sphenoid, lesser wing, greater wing. Now this is, I don't know why we're jumping around here, but that's okay. Here's another foramen. Obviously you can see the foramen magnum down here at the bottom. That's that big opening at the bottom. But on either side of that, you have an opening called the jugular foramen. Anybody want to guess what goes for the jugular foramen? Jugular vein, yes, exactly. On its way back to the heart from the brain, the jugular vein passes down on each side of the foramen magnum and into each of these jugular foramens. There's one on either side here. The jugular vein is one of those exceptions to the rule of arteries and veins having the same name. The jugular foramen is the counterpart to the carotid artery. The carotid artery goes to the brain, and the jugular veins bring blood back. And so in most cases, the artery and the vein will share this, have the, like in your arm, you'll have a radial artery and a radial vein. Radial artery goes out, radial vein comes back. Ulnar artery goes out, ulnar vein comes back. Most places in our bodies are like that, except the jugular and the carotid. They're the exception. So anyway, jugular foramen. There's the foramen magnum. There is the sella turcica, that little dimple area. Sella turcica means Turk's saddle in Latin. And the shape of the sella turcica is somewhat like a saddle, and it protects the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is about the size and shape of a pea, and it dangles down off the brain right in this very protected area. And if you look at your skull, if you take the top off your skull, you can see that there's a little grooved area on the inside where the sella turcica, that's the sella turcica, and you can imagine this little pea-shaped pituitary gland sitting inside there. You have 4 foramens in here, all for the passage of nerves, probably cranial nerves going to and from the brain. And the outer 2 are called the foramen ovale, and the inner 2 are called the foramen lacerum. So to remember what they are, all you need to remember is that just remember the sequence. Come on, there we go. O, L, L, O. Ovale, lacerum, lacerum, ovale. The ovalles are on the outside, the lacerums are on the inside. This is an ovale, this is an ovale. The two in the middle are the lacerums. They're the same names on both sides. Foramen ovale, foramen lacerum, then foramen ovale on the outside, foramen lacerum on the inside. We see cranial nerves. There's 12 different cranial nerves, and they're going to come in from both sides into the brain, and 2 of them are passing through these openings here. So the easiest way to remember this is just OLLO, because they're the same ones. Now, okay, that's now close up on the sphenoid bone, separated out. You know, again, the lesser wing is the smaller portion of it there. What I like about this is it does show you exactly where the sella turcica is. It's, you know, you can see the area that looks like a saddle right in here. And of course, the pituitary is going to sit right inside there. And of course, there's the sella turcica. We have it highlighted here. So can't emphasize enough, this is one of the most protected areas of the body because after all, the pituitary gland is what we call the master gland of the body. It releases 8 different hormones, which controls reproduction and growth and thyroid activity and milk production and muscle enlargement and skeletal enlargement and our response to stress and glucose levels, all sorts of things. So it's a very, you know, it's a very, very important gland, and it is as protected as it can be inside the sella turcica. Sphenoid bone again. Okay, and again. Now, here's our temporal bone, finally off the sphenoid bone. Off to the side, temporal bone extends not just from the outside, but it sticks into the base of the skull. Again, parts of the brain rest on top of this. And this is located directly behind the sphenoid bone. Remember, the sphenoid bone is a very, very large bone. And then we have the temporal bone coming in on each side of it, just behind it. As we can see where the temporal bone is there. And if we go back one, so you can see, there is the, let me get this to stop for a second. Okay, so not only do we see the temporal bone here, I mean the sphenoid bone, this is the end of the sphenoid bone here, but this area all along in here is the temporal bone, not just the outside area, but all the way extending in. It joins with the occipital bone. The occipital bone comes in from, this is the occipital bone in here, and it comes together with the temporal bone, and it runs up against the sphenoid bone. Again, like I said, like we said, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle. And you can see the end of the sphenoid and the temporal bone then is right behind it, if you will. Now, the temporal bone, in addition to making up part of the base of the skull, also has a passageway through it for the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve has to come in on each side. See that little opening on the side here? And let me, here we go. Let's try it now. See that opening right here? That's the external opening for the auditory nerve to go into in through the skull to reach the brain. And if we get rid of that and open it up again, you can see that it's going to follow. Oops, sorry. If you look at there, this area right here, this ridge line, there's an opening in the ridge line right here And that ridge line protects the auditory nerve, which is inside that, and it comes out through this little opening here. And this is the internal opening for the auditory nerve, as opposed to the external opening. There's the external. That's the entrance, the external auditory meatus. And this is the internal. You have one on each side. So the auditory nerve runs through that little ridge there to reach the brain. Okay. Now temporal bone on the outside, you can see it finishes off, it joins with the zygomatic bone. You know, if you follow your cheekbone all the way back, you're going to be rubbing the end of the edge of the temporal bone. By the time you get all the way back here, you can feel that if you come back off the zygomatic bone. And by the time you get all the way to the end of it, you're feeling your temporal bone right here, usually right in front of the opening for the ear. So looking straight down into the skull, we can see the jugular foramen on each side. This little tiny opening here on either side of the foramen magnum is a very important opening. This is the hypoglossal canal. The hypoglossal canal is the passageway for the hypoglossal nerve. And the hypoglossal nerve at the end of the table. Now, the hypoglossal nerve is one of the cranial nerves. There's 12 cranial nerves. The hypoglossal nerve controls our ability to swallow and to speak. It controls our tongue, and it's controlled from the brainstem. And if we have damage to the brainstem, then we usually lose the ability to swallow or to speak. So there's a little tiny opening there. That little nerve that goes through there is very powerful. And if you have a patient that that you suspect has had a stroke, and they have difficulty in swallowing, and they have difficulty in speaking, then it may, particularly if they're having trouble swallowing, the biggest thing is that they try to drink or eat something and they start choking on it. That means they may be having trouble with swallowing. If that's the case, then the damage is likely in the base of the brain. Simply, and you can detect that simply by, is the hypoglossal nerve working correctly? Swallowing is a reflex, and the medulla oblongata in the brainstem is a reflex center for swallowing. So anyway, so that's the hypoglossal canal. It's a tiny opening, but a very powerful nerve goes through that. And so, okay, let's move on now. So close up here. Now looking at the base of the brain, this is the ridge line that I was talking about earlier. This ridge line across here and here, these openings here are the openings for the auditory nerve to come through to go into the brain. The area of the brain that processes sound is on the temporal lobes on the near the middle of the brain. And so we see there's the optic foramen rotundum. Okay, here's one. Okay, these are the openings here, the internal acoustic or auditory meatus. So the auditory nerves are going to come through those ridge lines on either side and pop out right there where those holes are, and then go directly into the brain. So the brain can process the sound. Again, like the eyeball. The eye has no idea what it's seeing. Well, the ear has no idea what it's hearing. We have to interpret everything inside our brain. And so we have to get the signal through the bone, through the nerve, to the brain. Let's see. And we call that ridge line the petrous portion of the temporal bone. It's a very pronounced, very prominent ridge line inside the skull. So, and the opening there on either side of it. Now, this is a very unusual, very odd angle here because you can see the optic foramen. That's one of the openings that we see if we look in the orbit where the optic nerve comes through. Now this angle is tilted somewhat so that it exposes another foramen that you normally don't see when you're looking into your skull. So this is not a straight on shot. Because if I go back a couple slides and show you straight down into it like this, there, if I'm looking straight down into it, you can see this is the opening right above the lettering there. Let's try it without getting carried away. There we go. Okay. There's the opening for the optic nerve there. But there's another foramen hidden by this edge of bone right here. It's sort of tucked away there. Now, if we take the skull and we tilt the skull in a forward view, it exposes this other opening. There's the optic foramen up there. But here's this other nerve, this other opening right here, and it's above the ovale, lastrum ovale. And that's what you're seeing right here. Now, it's not a big deal. I probably made a bigger deal out of it than I should. It's just that there's a view here that you get, it's not what you're normally expecting to see. So if you look at so here we're looking at straight on into the skull, and we can see the opening for the optic nerve there and there. There's the sella turcica right there. Ovale, lastrum ovale. Now, if we tilt the skull forward, it exposes, let me mark it so we can see it a little better, there and there. If we tilt the skull forward, we get the same angle we see on the PowerPoint, where we sort of lose the ovale lastrum openings, but you can see the foramen, the optic foramen very nicely, and that little dark spot there below it I marked with the pencil there is the foramen rotundum. A lot of work for. Now let's go back to share screen. And so, okay. So here we see the optic foramen, the foramen rotundum. We see the internal acoustic meatus, the petrous portion of the temporal bone, and it's setting above the foramen magnum right there. And of course, these are the hypoglossal canals here and here, and these are the jugular foramens here and here on either side. Now, the other structure, the ethmoid bone, what's the ethmoid bone do for us? Well, the ethmoid bone, it starts out on either side of the orbit, goes into the middle of the nasal structure and proceeds upward into the base of the skull. And this is the passageway for olfactory nerves. The ability to smell things is based on a whole olfactory receptors lining the internal top of our nasal cavity, sending signals through the olfactory nerves up through the ethmoid bone. If you look carefully, you can see tiny openings, perforations in the ethmoid bone. Those are passageways for the olfactory nerve to go up into the brain. And so the ethmoid bone has a structure known as the cribriform plate, and it's perforated, and lots of tiny openings for olfactory branches of the olfactory nerve to go up into the brain. And that's what you're seeing right there. And at the top of the ethmoid bone, because you can see now, here's the portion of it that we find in the orbit. There's one on the other side. Remember, I said it extends down into the nasal cavity proper. These little, you can just start to see some of the perforations there, the cribriform plate. There's another portion of it called the crista galli, which sticks up here. And the crista galli that we see, 58 is the crista galli and 59 is the cribriform plate. You can almost imagine there's some openings there. And the crista galli is where we attach the coverings of the brain, the meninges. The meninges are tough layers of connective tissue that surround the brain, allow the brain to float inside cerebrospinal fluid. They attach at that bump there at 58 so that the brain doesn't go sliding around inside the skull. Because the brain is squishy, the brain won't support its own weight. It's like oatmeal. It's about the consistency of cold oatmeal, and it'll move around. We don't want that. So it's suspended inside this sac called the meninges, and the meninges are tied to that structure there, and the brain doesn't move. Of course, now here in the animation there, you can see the cribriform plate and is in green, and the yellow are the the olfactory nerves coming back to the rest of the brain. So, okay, crista galli, cribriform plate right there. On the underside of the skull, what we see here is the carotid canal. Carotid artery passes through here on the way up to the brain. You know, it's right next to the jugular foramen. Jugular veins come down and the carotid arteries go up and they run side by side. So even though they're different names, I don't know why we didn't call it the carotid vein, but we don't. We call it the jugular vein. Both of them are designed to supply and drain the area of the brain. Okay. This new term, fossa. Fossa means flat area. Mandibular fossa. It's the flat area where the mandible articulates with the skull itself. So we'll see a lot of fossas throughout the body. This this straight up and down perpendicular bone here is called the vomer. The vomer divides the nasal cavity into a left and right side. This is called the palatine bone. The palatine bone starts the formation of the roof of our mouth. So if you stick your finger in your mouth and you feel the roof of your mouth, what you're feeling is the palatine bone and what we call the palatine process of the maxilla. It's the hard roof of our mouth. And here we see, this is what the rest of it looks like. There's the palatine process of the maxilla. There's the palatine bone right there. And then directly below that is the vomer. Of course, foramen magnum again. Styloid process again. Mastoid process again. Occipital condyle, another term, condyle. You know, a fossa is a flat area, a condyle is a bump. Condyles can either go up and down or side to side. We have condyles and we have epicondyles. If it's an epicondyle, it goes side to side. If it's a condyle, it goes up and down. The occipital condyles are what the skull sits on top of the spinal column with. Well, they took my skeleton. At the very first vertebrae, cervical vertebrae number 1 has 2 depressions on it, so that the occipital condyles can rest on top of C1. You look at the base of your skull, on each side of the foramen magnum, you'll see a little dimple area. That's the occipital condyle. And it's designed so that it will rest right there on top of C1. When I get my skeleton back, I'll show you that. And there's another foramen, stylomastoid foramen. It's right next to the, it's between the mastoid process and the styloid process. And again, it's probably the passageway for a nerve at this point. So, okay. Perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Remember, the vomer divides the nasal cavity in half in the back. the ethmoid divides it into two parts in the front. And you can see that part that sticks through in the front is still part of the ethmoid bone. But once we get to the posterior portion of the nasal cavity, it's now called the vomer. Now the labella is this spot directly above the nasal bone where the frontal bone fused together. When we were in utero and we were developing, our frontal bone started out as two membranes and they grew together into one. We didn't get a suture out of it. When we were in utero, we had a suture line, but it closed. All that we have left is this little mark here called the labella directly above the nasal bone. Let's see. There is our external auditory meatus, the counterpart to the internal one. Again, if you have an external anything, you got to have an internal something. Now, we're almost done here. This is the fetal skull. So this is somewhere after 8 weeks after fertilization, but before childbirth. And our skull is developing. This is a model, not a real one. And I'll go ahead and pass this around. I'm not going to throw it. So, but you can see a number of interesting structures here on this. You can see, of course, the orbits have formed. What you do see that's different on this is there is a frontal, there's a sagittal suture that divides us into two frontal bones. We don't have that after we're born. They close together. And all we have left is the labella down here. But this is the fetal skull. There's the frontal suture, which disappears. There is what we call the anterior fontanelle. Fontanelles are soft spots. And because our bones are growing in our skull, and our bones don't stop growing in our bodies until we're about 25 years old. And our brain has to grow more rapidly than any other part of our body does. And so our skull has to accommodate that by being flexible. And this fontanelle, this soft spot, allows that flexibility. And so it's a very large and right at the center of the skull, right at the top of the skull. There are the frontal bones. Now we see the fetal skull again. There's the parietal bone. There's the frontal bone. We can see the coronal suture right here. There's our temporal bone. There's our coronal suture. Now here is another fontanelle. This is called the sphenoidal fontanelle, right behind the sphenoid bone. So again, it gives us a little flexibility and growth here. There's another fontanelle back here called the mastoid fontanelle near the mastoid process. But the anterior fontanelle is on the top. Now, if we have an anterior anything, there's going to be a posterior. It's just the way the nomenclature for anatomy works. And so if we look here, there's our soft spot, the anterior fontanelle. Because this is still connective tissue. It has not calcified yet. So it's still soft and pliable. Frontal suture, coronal suture, sagittal suture. This goes away. This frontal suture goes away. We look at the base of the skull, we're going to see the posterior fontanelle. It's not nearly as dramatic as the anterior fontanelle. There's our sagittal suture, parietal bones, lambdoid suture, and here is the posterior fontanelle. So we have the anterior fontanelle, the posterior fontanelle, the two mastoid fontanelles, and the two sphenoidal fontanelles. The one that gives us the greatest flexibility is going to be the anterior fontanelle. It'll be the last to close too. And as I said, we don't stop forming up our bones until we're about 25 years old. So, and there's the occipital bone. And there is the skull. Any questions on this? Yes?
Is the skull going to be covered on the lab exam next week?
No, it's not. The skull and the axial and appendicular skeleton is all going to be on lab tests too. That's probably at least a month or 5 weeks, at least 5 weeks away. So, yes.
When it comes to the skeleton exam, what would you say the distribution of questions will be when it comes to just labeling things like the diagrams we look at today and then knowing the actual relation to bodily functions? Would you say like maybe percentages?
Not a lot of function at all. The lab is more anatomy. I can tell you that probably almost, because there's so many bones in the skull, there'll be a lot of emphasis on the skull, and then probably a quarter of it on the axial and appendicular. So, because there's just so many bones to choose from on the skull. So, but that's a good question. Any other questions? So, okay, well then I will close this out again and then end it. Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you all later. Yes, ma'am. Oh yeah, thank you for reminding me. I almost closed out again. I want to do a quick review of the test for next week. So I'm glad you said something. So you just wanted to see me close it out and open it up again, didn't you? So, okay, lab test next week is going to be primarily anatomy. You're going to need to know the parts of the microscope. So, things like the ocular and the body tube, and this is the ocular. Where's the camera? There's the camera. Okay, there's the ocular and the bring it over here. Adjust this camera a little bit. There we go. So parts of the microscope. So we would see the ocular, the body tube, the objective lenses, the stage, the fine focus, the coarse adjustment, the light, hard-hitting light source, and all the what do the objective lenses show? What's the magnification of the objective lenses? It's 4x for the red lens. That's the scanning power. 10x for the low power. That's the blue band. And 40x for the, 10x for the yellow, 40x for the blue. The total magnification that we use in lab is 400. The ocular is always 10 magnifications. The objective lens is either going to be 4, 10, or 40. 10 times 40 is 400, so that's high power. 10 times 10 is 100, that's low power. And 10 times 4 is scanning power, that's 40. So there are a fair number of questions about the parts of the microscope and magnification, things like that. I can't think if there's any other really hard-hitting things like light switches and bases and stuff like that on there. Now that's the microscope. As far as the tissues go, you should be able to look at the epithelial tissues and tell me the difference between simple, identify simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. Simple cuboidal, get rid of this, close that out. Okay. So simple cuboidal, shaped like little cubes. We find them in the kidney tubules. Simple columnar, we find shaped like columns. We find them in the small intestine. We have simple squamous. We find those in our lungs. We have the other version of epithelial cells are stratified. Stratified squamous is the most common type of stratified cells. We find that in our skin, in our mouth, in our nasal cavity, anywhere where we're going to have wear and tear. The stratified squamous cells. So there's 3 types of epithelial: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. They can either be stratified, layered, or simple, single layered. We see most of our simple cuboidal in the kidneys. We see most of our simple columnar in the small intestine. The transitional epithelial is what we see in the urinary bladder because it expands into to accommodate the bladder getting bigger. And the other outlier was the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial, the ones with the cilia, the hairs sticking up on it. The respiratory tract and in the oviduct of the female. So we have it in our nasal cavity, in our trachea, and in the female oviduct. There it moves the egg along. In the respiratory tract, it uses to push mucus to our throat so we can swallow it. As far as the connective tissue goes, if I show you a slide of compact bone, you should be able to tell me that that's an osteocyte, a bone cell in the lacunae in there. The lacunae is the little dark bubble inside the bone. The osteocyte is the living bone cell in here. In hyaline cartilage, it's called a chondrocyte. It's also in a lacunae. In both cases, the chondrocyte started out as a chondroblast. That's a cartilage builder. Whenever you see the term blast, it means it's a builder. The chondroblast is laying down gel for cartilage, and it backs itself into a corner essentially and forms a bubble called the lacunae, and you have the living chondrocyte inside the matrix. In the bone, the osteoblast does the same thing. It lays down the matrix, the hard bone. It solidifies around it. It's trapped in the matrix, but it's being fed through arteries and veins, little tiny arteries and veins, and it's converted to a living bone cell, the osteocyte inside here. The bone cell looks like the rings of a tree. The cartilage looks like a bunch of bubbles. The hyaline cartilage looks like a bunch of bubbles. I could go bring that up if you'd like me to. The blood is connective tissue, and you should be able to tell me which ones are red cells, which are most of them in the blood. The white cells are the ones that stain purple, and the platelets are the little tiny fragments. The dense connective tissue has lots of collagen fibers in there. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the body, and it has a distinct weave to it. Adipose tissue is connective tissue. Adipose tissue has adipose cells, and it stores fat, but it also has elastic fibers woven in through there. And you have the reticular fibers that work as packing material that help hold organs together, like the spleen. And so we call that irregular connective tissue. And we have the dense regular, which is the stuff that we make tendons and ligaments out of. Like the Achilles tendon that attaches your calf muscle to your heel is made of collagen. So in muscles, we have three types of muscles. We have smooth muscle, which is involuntary. We don't control it. It's around our blood vessels and around our digestive system. We have skeletal muscle, which is voluntary at our arms and our legs. We control that. It is what we call striated muscle. It has stripes, light and dark bands in there. It also has many nuclei. And so we have strict we control that by, I want to raise my right arm. So I raise my right arm, I bring it back down. That's voluntary control. And then the third category is cardiac muscle. It has striations, but it's involuntary. We don't control the heart. The heart also has branches. It only has one nucleus, and it has intercalated disc where the muscle cells connect together. The difference between the heart and skeletal muscle is that in skeletal muscle, we determine how much effort we want to spend to do something. Whether we're going to pick this up and set it down gently or slam it down. We determine how many muscle cells we're going to use. In the heart, we use every cell for every contraction. Every cell in the heart contracts to its fullest extent. But here, while I'm using a number of cells to do this, and every cell I'm using is contracting to its fullest extent, I'm not using all the cells. As opposed to if this were 100 pounds, it'd be different. If I were annoyed, I would slam it down. That would be different. Because I can control the number of cells that I'm using. Every cell that I'm using is going to contract to its fullest extent, but I'm not using every cell in my muscles. Whereas the heart is different. So The heart has branching cells, but they are striated. That's the only similarity they have to skeletal muscle. And then the last tissue category was the nervous tissue. You had a great big purple neuron, and you had the little tiny glial cell as the two types of nerve cells. The other thing we looked at were the structures of the cells, the nucleus where the DNA is located, the cytoplasm, and the cell membrane that separates the cell from another cell. I mentioned how if we had done the cheek cell slide, you would have seen the nucleus, on your own cells right there. We also talked about the stages of mitosis, so be able to identify prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, cytokinesis, where the physical separation of the two daughter cells, and interphase, the time when a cell's busy being a cell. You had pictures of cells where the nucleus is visible, and that's interphase. When the nucleus is gone but the chromosomes are visible, that's prophase. When they line up in the middle of the cell, that's metaphase. When they start moving apart, that's anaphase. When they're completely moved apart, that's telophase. Cytokinesis starts in anaphase. Anaphase is also the shortest of all stages. And then you have your two daughter cells. And then we also talked about diffusion and osmosis. Be able to tell me diffusion is movement from a high concentration of a substance to a low concentration. And osmosis is movement of water from high water to low water. Okay, questions on any of that? I know it was brief, but that's the summary of what we're looking at. So everything you need should be in the study guide. Everything else should be in the, if you go to the lab manual, which is in the table of contents, you can find, you can list everything there. If I didn't mention it, then it's not going to be testable. So if it's in a list somewhere, but I didn't say anything about it, or I didn't look at all the structures on one of the on parts of the microscope, then don't worry about it. So I'm not gonna, this isn't to show how much I know and how much you don't. This is just to make sure you can identify these structures. So, okay, questions? Did that help? Good. Okay, I'm glad. So, okay, if you have any questions between now and next week, let me know. So, otherwise, we're going to get out of here.